This is lecture number 2 of circulatory physiology, and let's dive in. So, the learning objectives are here. There are 3, quite crucial actually, because we'll be dealing with one of the mainstays of uh, one of the main things that circulation is basically there for, and that is basically blood pressure. To have blood pressure in the arterial side such that the whole system keeps moving. If you have problems with blood pressure on the arterial side, as you can see later on, you will have all sorts of issues with A, the heart itself, and B, the perfusion of tissues on the arterial side, and C, the venous return through the venous system back to the heart. And so a cycle, negative cycle sort of is established. So blood pressure is a very, I would say in circulatory terms, a very sacred thing which needs to be maintained at all costs. And when we look at and when we study the regulation of blood pressure, you will see the plethora of mechanisms that are just dedicated to control blood pressure, arterial blood pressure. They, in their numbers, they indicate how important the body, this importance of this blood pressure is in the body, that so many mechanisms have been invested in it. So we'll be looking at blood pressures, systolic, diastolic, as you probably may have heard these terms. We'll look at pulse pressure, mean arterial pressure, very important. We'll look at how do we calculate these blood pressures and their clinical significance. I'll just turn on my gadget here. Yes. So there we go. Now, this is picking up from where we left off in the first lecture. We talked about delta P, and that it's the delta P basically. Let me just go back to this diagram, which I showed in the first lecture extensively. This is that, if you remember, this is that closed circuit simplified diagram depicting the cardiovascular system in human beings. The delta P is provided by the heart, and we spoke at length about this, that if the heart does not provide, it doesn't beat, and it does not provide the propelling pressure, the delta P, nothing in the circulation will happen. It's in fact the heart's beating continuous and in sequence that provides the delta P, that provides the difference, that flow of blood takes place in the arterial side, and that propels the whole thing forwards, back into the heart, and so on and so forth. So once that heartbeat creating the difference of pressure uh, pumps a bolus, a certain volume of blood, we call it stroke volume, into the aorta. What happens in the aorta is a pressure wave is generated in the aorta. So, well, if you're sitting in the aorta, nothing is happening. And suddenly a door opens, the aortic valve, and a gush of blood is pumped into where you're sitting and its surroundings, the ascending aorta. What you will find is the aorta will expand to accommodate it. Okay, and this is that pressure that is exerted, that we talked about in the far end of the first lecture, that this is the kind of distending pressure on the aorta, and then there's a pressure which is converted into kinetic energy, which propels the blood forwards. And these two, according to Bernoulli's principle, they are constant. If you remember, we spoke about the Bernoulli's principle in the last lecture, right? Anyhow, today we are talking much simpler, that this introduction of this bolus of blood in the ascending aorta, it forms a pressure wave in its wall, which is then propelled throughout the arterial walls, throughout the arteries, down the circuit. And it is this pressure wave, which is also called the arterial pulse, that you can feel on the radial artery in a patient or anyone. And those pulsations are basically a reflection of what the heart is doing to the aorta. i.e., with each beat, it's introducing a stroke volume, a known volume of blood into the aorta that stretches the aorta, forms the pressure wave, which then is felt distally in the circulation. It's a very simple thing, really, this pressure wave or pulse, which goes down the arterial circuit. Just a little physics again. The pressure wave in the wall precedes the actual blood flow. So the blood flow is just a tad little bit behind the pressure wave itself. So the pressure wave hits a point of circulation first, then comes the tsunami, if you want to make that concept, the blood flow right after the pressure wave has hit that point in circulation. So that's that. This you will understand if you look at this diagram. So it's a nice diagram in which the authors, they have divided the circulation simply into various sections. They start from the left ventricle, then they talk about the arteries, then arterioles, capillaries, veins, and back to the heart, the right atrium. So you notice that when we are talking about the pressure, the left atrium, the left ventricle, I beg your pardon, it registers the most change in pressure. Because if you remember from your cardiac cycle discussion, discussion in isovolumetric contraction, and preceding to that, there's a long phase of diastole in which the ventricles are filled with blood. And then the contraction starts. The contraction is divided into isovolumetric contraction, ejection, and then isovolumetric relaxation. This is basically all that in one stroke of the ventricle. You should concentrate on the pressure that it generates. It generates pressure from the start of the very low pressure, which is basically the end systolic pressure. It builds it up, and at 80, it would open the aortic valve, and then ejection would happen, if you remember from the cardiac cycle. Now, if we pick up proceedings, because we're talking about circulation really, if you talk about arteries, so this section becomes of interest, this section right here, okay? This section. So we're talking about the big arteries. So when the blood is introduced in the artery, just focus on my highlighter here. So the resting pressure, it's a crucial point, the resting pressure of the artery, the big artery, say the aorta, is 80 mmHg. This is the minimum pressure. When you introduce a bolus of blood, it rises from 80 to 120. And when the heart stops beating, goes into diastole, this pressure drops back to 80. And then the heart beats again, introduces another bolus of blood. It again goes up to 120. Okay. Now, as you move along, we will talk about why it doesn't go below 80 in the next slide or two. Uh, if we just move along now to the arterioles, then to the distal arterioles, and then you see right here, before it hits the capillary network, these pulsations that we are referring to as arterial pressure pulsations, they sort of die down. In fact, if you look at the overall pattern of this, the most pulsations are in the systemic arteries, the big arteries. And as you go down the circuit, do smaller arteries to arterioles, it really sort of the whole party goes down, okay, of the pulsations. And as soon as it hits the capillaries, the pulsations are gone. And what you have is a straight, simple, straight descending line of pressure. The pressure is going down, but not in pulsatile form. Rather, it's continuous blood flow, continuous blood flow. So the difference here is clear. It's pulsatile blood flow right up till arterioles, and later on, the pulse wave, it disappears, and you have smooth blood flow passing through the capillaries. You want that to happen, the veins, and back to the right atrium. If you really remember the last section of the lecture, lecture number one, we talked about in an ideal system, energy would not be dissipated as the blood flows through the arterial circuit. So basically, what happens is, since it's not an ideal circuit, it's what reality is. So as the blood flows through the bigger capillaries towards the smaller capillaries, it continuously is coming in touch with the vessel wall. There is friction over there. And then another point is friction between the blood cells themselves also retard the flow velocity of blood. And hence the pressure waveform decreases in its amplitude. And as soon as it comes out of arterioles, the pressure really has gone down so much that it's not pulsatile anymore. Merely flows through the capillaries. Now, there is another just footnote about this. In the capillaries, you would want smooth, uh, no drama, no event, a simple, plain film of blood going through the capillaries, get stuff getting exchanged with the tissues. Again, no drama, no event. It needs to be smooth. Everything. This whole operation was done so that capillaries could perfuse the tissues, the most crucial part of the whole circulation, right? All this is just transport of blood to the tissues at the capillary level. So this needs to be continuous streamlined blood flow, and so on and so forth. Right, I think we have discussed the main points of this graph. A couple of things which should be, I guess I should introduce them right now. You see a labeling here, systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. You see that when the pressure in the arteries peaks, that is referred to as the systolic blood pressure. And when it goes to its lowest ebb, it's called the diastolic blood pressure. So systolic blood pressure is the highest blood pressure during a cycle, and diastolic is the lowest pressure in the cycle. If you want to correlate it with heart, the cardiac cycle, the diastole and the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure, you would again notice that the diastolic pressures of the heart are very low, as it's indicated here as well. But in the systemic circulation, the diastolic pressures are kept at around 80. This is obviously, we're talking about a normal human being. Okay. The upper edge is same, 120, both of the ventricle systolic pressure and the systemic circulation systolic blood pressure. However, the difference again is in the diastolic pressure. You see that in ventricle, it really dips down below even 10, while again, I repeat, that the diastolic pressure in systemic circulation uh, does not go or should not go normally beyond 80. This is a crucial observation to observe and remember. Another way of looking at systolic and diastolic is if you subtract diastolic from systolic, i.e. systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure, you get another statistic. It's called pulse pressure. Again, pulse pressure has a very, very key importance in the clinical side of things that we will study later on. And right at the end, but not uh, by any means the least, is mean arterial pressure, which we will later abbreviate as MAP or MAP. You should call it really mean arterial pressure. This is the pressure which, in layman terms, you call blood pressure, BP. It's actually not pulse pressure. It's not even this. It's basically mean arterial pressure. And if you look up closely, there is a these lines are red, but there's a pink line right here. A pink line is passing through these pulsations and going really smoothly down the circuit. This pink line is referred to as the mean arterial pressure. The perceptive student with an interest in mathematics would immediately notice that this mean is not really an arithmetic mean, because the placement of this curve is not really in the mean, the arithmetic mean of this wavefront. It's rather more skewed towards the diastolic side. Again, we'll come back to this mean arterial pressure, uh, but enough teasers about these four keywords. Okay, so we can come back to this. For now, this is basically a tutorial topic, as I have noted here. These are different aortic pulsations which are plotted against a reference normal uh, aortic pulsation. So this is what normally happens. What is this dip called here? If you remember, this dip, I so miss live lectures because I would stop the lecture here and have a little moment of Q&A with you guys. But anyhow, this dip is called incisura. This is that dip that is caused by the closing of the aortic valve. Anyhow, so this is the normal amplitude. It again is plotted between 80 and 120, as I just mentioned, and this goes on and on. But in certain situations, and Guyton discusses this 1, 2, 3, and 4, the wavefront really becomes abnormal. Again, you'll be discussing this with your tutorial teachers tomorrow, that is Tuesday, in the tutorial. But just to give you an idea of what's happening here. Arteriosclerosis, basically this is a condition in which there is adipose tissue deposition in the walls of the arteries, and resultantly they become hard, i.e. they are not flexible like a younger person's arteries would be. And this is a process, it's like a ticking bomb. This is a process which you can't really stop. It accelerates as you hit 20 and above of age. And as the age progresses above 40, it accelerates. And it just goes on and on till the arteries actually are different in an older person than what are the type of arteries that he had when he was a younger chap. They are flexible when the person is young, and they're harder when this person has aged because of that adipose tissue deposition. How does it affect the aortic pulsations? And this is where physiology meets clinical medicine. So you compare this normal waveform with a waveform of arteriosclerosis. Again, the heart is doing its business. Considering, let's assume that the heart is doing its business normally. It is introducing the same amount of blood in the aorta. But instead of this happening, this happens. This happens. And what is this? This is basically you're introducing the same amount of blood, but this time the arteries are more rigid. They are not flexible. So while a normal aorta would accommodate blood and won't let the whole system go above 120 any significantly, this hardened artery would not expand with this new blood coming in. And because it hasn't expanded, the rise in pressure within it, the stiffer artery, would be much greater, okay. And hence the waveform changes, and the diastolic pressure would come down, okay, because it's not flexing. This point I will discuss in the following slide. So you'll be discussing this patent ductus arteriosus and aortic regurgitation in your tutorial, inshallah. Coming to the arterial pressures individually. Now, let me just fix this. Okay. Of the ventricle and the systolic and diastolic pressures of the systemic circulation. This is one of those very confusing points that sometimes you get um, very funny answers about. So I have discussed this in the previous slide. The systolic and diastolic pressures of the left ventricle are different because of the diastole. The pressure during the diastole really goes down. However, the systemic circulation, the diastolic pressure, usually doesn't go below 80. This is one of the main differences. And this systolic pressure is not the ventricle systolic pressure. We're talking about the arteries now. This is circulation. So when the examiner talks to you about the blood pressure, you should switch your mind into circulation. He or she is talking about systolic pressure inside the arteries, diastolic pressure inside the arteries, okay? It might not register at this moment in time here, but trust me, I've had my share of embarrassing situations. Obviously, on the due to some students, some very funny answers. And let me just take this opportunity to tell you that blood pressure measurement is an absolute minimum that you need to be really comfortable with in a practical. Yani, if you get a practical of blood pressure, you should do it as if you have been doing it for a long time. And best is to practice on your siblings, on your parents, so that it really comes naturally to you. Examiners usually judge the student who gets the BP practical, the way this person handles him or herself during the various maneuvers of blood pressure checking. So be careful about these very basic things. They matter a lot. So here, just to elaborate this whole thing so that you understand the difference between the systole, diastole of the heart and the arteries. When the heart goes into systole, it again, as have mentioned again and again, it introduces blood into the aorta or in the arteries, let's say, to generalize this. When it does that, it was resting at its normal diameter. But when systole in the heart happens, the blood is introduced here. These arteries get distended in three directions. One is, two are across their diameter to distend them, and one is that kinetic energy thing which propels the centermost layers of the blood forwards towards the arterioles. Okay, I think this is very clear. During diastole of the heart, there is no forward propelling delta P like situation. So what happens is they relax. When they contract on on the bolus of blood that was introduced within the systole. So when the driving force has been switched off and the heart goes into relaxation to its own diastole, the diastolic phase of arteries also starts. And during this, the distended arteries, since they have a lot of elastic tissue, they bounce back inwards. And this then propels the blood forwards during the diastole. So very, very crucially, the blood gets distended, the blood distends the arteries and flows forwards during the systolic phase of the artery. And during the diastole phase, when the walls come in, when the walls contract due to elastic recoil of the artery, the blood again also flows in the forward direction. So you have forward motion both in systole and diastole. Now, to jog your brain a bit, let me throw in a curveball here. What if, imagine, what if the arteries were made of steel? Think about it. What if the arteries were made of steel? Now, just make a steel artery, steel, everything from aorta down to the arteriole, just convert it in your mind into steel, i.e., something which is fixed in diameter. Okay, connected to the aortic valve, and now pump the heart one beat at a time. Now, when the ventricle goes into systole, it introduces that same bolus of blood into the steel aorta. What would happen? Imagine. I'll give you a few seconds. Get those brain juices flowing. What will happen? You will have a spectacular increase in systolic pressure, wouldn't you? Correlated with what happens in arteriosclerosis. What happened here? Well, not steel, but adipose tissue rendered your elastic, nice, expandable, distendable arteries into something which is a bit more rigid, right? And look at the systolic upstroke. So now what I've done is, hypothetically, I've just made them of steel. So they cannot contract, they cannot distend. They are just fixed. So when you now push a bolus of blood in this steel system, it cannot distend. So the systolic pressure during contraction of the blood really goes up during inside the arteries, right? That's the simple bit. Try imagining what happens then. Would there be a diastole in this steel artery? No, sir, there won't be. For that diastole to happen, it should have distended and then contracted. That causes the forward motion during diastole of the arteries. That cannot happen in the steel artery. This is this is to show you the phenomena of diastole in arteries. So arteries are distendable. They contract. They have a lot of smooth muscle, lots of elastic tissue. When you expand them, they will contract as soon as you minus the driving force. Okay? Steel arteries, if they ever exist, cannot contract. Just to complete the sequence of the steel arteries, the blood would come in, and what would happen? It would raise the tension against the steel walls, and then propel the blood to some extent. And then what would happen? Since you cannot have a diastolic component in these hard arteries, the blood would cease to flow during diastole. So it can't even reach the arterioles. Now you understand the pulsatile flow, the role of the elasticity of the arteries and the diastolic phase of the arteries. What important role it plays in the propagation of blood flow throughout the arterial side of the circuit. If it not were for the diastolic contraction of the blood of the arteries, which would propel the blood forwards during no propelling motion from the heart, the thing would just stop flowing during diastole. Okay, so this is the importance of systolic and diastolic pressure. Um, some bits correlating it to the heart. The systolic pressure of the artery. Now, from now on, whenever I say systolic and diastolic, unless I mention it, it basically means systolic and diastolic phase of the arteries. So systolic pressure basically is under the control of cardiac output. The diastolic pressure is under the control of the arteries themselves. TPR is total peripheral resistance. We have spoken about it in the first lecture. If you haven't taken the first lecture, please first listen to that lecture and then come to this bit, because you won't be able to understand what this is if you haven't really studied that matter. Total peripheral resistance, very briefly, is the total amount of resistance put up by all the arterial tree together. So it's the resistance to blood flow inside the arterial system, mainly exerted by arterioles. So once again, the systolic pressure is controlled by cardiac output. If you have more cardiac output, the systolic pressure would naturally go more up, which will increase. In the diastolic pressure, however, if you increase the total peripheral resistance, you are basically contracting the arteries. This will affect the blood pressure congruently in a negative way. Now, pulse pressure is, we have, I think, exhausted this bit here, systolic and diastolic. Um, this pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure is the feature of the rest of the most of this, actually rest of all of this lecture. We'll be talking about pulse pressure and mean arterial pressure. First, we talk about pulse pressure. As I mentioned to you, when you subtract diastolic from systolic, you get pulse pressure. So 120 minus 80 is 40 mmHg. So 40 mmHg is the average pulse pressure. Systolic pressure is affected by your cardiac output or stroke volume. As you know, it's the same thing. Cardiac output is the output of the heart, the working of the heart per unit time. Stroke volume is the volume of blood that is pumped per beat. So cardiac output and stroke volume can be used interchangeably. Systolic pressure is affected by stroke volume or cardiac output. Diastolic pressure is basically total peripheral resistance. You can also mention compliance, because again, it will take you to the first lecture. Compliance means accommodation of blood in a vessel. Resistance means the opposite, decrease accommodation of blood inside a vessel is called resistance. You increase the resistance, you decrease the compliance. So diastolic pressure is affected by arterial status, whether it is a nice elastic artery, which is compliant, low in resistance, or is it a hardened or relatively hardened artery, low in compliance, more in resistance? This means the whole thing, i.e., this whole thing basically determines what the diastolic pressure would be. Okay, these are some of the examples of pulse pressures. A weak and thready. You'll study shock in the end very briefly. To introduce it, shock basically is an inability of the circulation to provide adequate blood flow throughout the circulation. So everything goes down, all the pressures go down. Obviously, then the wave front that we talked about, the pulse wave, the pulsation, they also, the pressure goes down. So when a person is in shock and you were to take this person's radial pulse, you would feel that the pulse is very weak because the wave fronts are very weak due to, say, loss of blood. There's not enough thrust in the arteries to make a proper pulse. In this person, we call this pulse weak or thready pulse. Thready is just like, it's like a bead of threads hitting against your fingers on the radial artery. So this is how we describe that. In exercise, you have strong pulse. If you exercise, try taking your pulse. You will see that it is bounding, it's hitting your fingers nicely and more than when you are at rest. Then there are clinical scenarios in which one is right here, aortic insufficiency, in which the aortic valve has lost its proper opening and closure. It's flimsy now. During the entire systole of the left ventricle, it's incompetent. So it just flaps around. And this kind of system in the aortic valve generates a collapsing or water hammer pulse. It goes up sharply and drops back sharply as well. It is not like a normal pressure pulse. Again, this can be expanded in your tutorial. So this is basically stuff about pulse pressure. Right at the end, we will be looking at some of the scenarios which involve blood pressure, pulse pressure. Going to mean arterial pressure. Now, mean arterial pressure is interesting. As I mentioned, the word mean does not mean arithmetic mean. Uh, this is basically we are looking at a minute to minute, or a millisecond or millisecond of blood pressure variation. So there's a time component to it. It's roughly an average blood pressure over a period of time. Yes, that's the way. It's an averaged blood pressure reading over a span of a unit of time. Uh, and this is how mean arterial pressure is basically defined. Um, its formula, there are multiple formulas, but I think the simplest mentioned in Guyton is it's diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. You know what pulse pressure is now. Pulse pressure is systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. So in this formula, diastolic pressure comes twice. Once in the definition of pulse pressure, and one the whole pulse pressure, diastolic pressure itself. So, and this is what I mentioned in the initial diagram as well, if you remember, that your mean arterial pressure is closer to the diastolic pressure than to the systolic pressure. Now you see the mathematical form of this right here. Diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. Remember, MCQs and SEQs can be designed, and rather are designed for you to calculate from the given data mean arterial pressure. So beware, such questions are commonly given in circulation tests. Okay, one other thing about this is that if you remember your heart physiology, the heart spends more time in diastole as compared to systole at normal heart rates. So when the human being is at rest, the heart is passing more time in diastole than systole, i.e., filling of the heart takes up more time than actually contracting the heart. Yes, 2/3 is diastole and 1/3 is systole, if you remember, at rest, that is. So it makes sense that the average of the overall average of the system of blood pressure would reflect more the diastole of the system than the systole. This is another way of understanding it. Okay. Now, these are basically the two main components, and I want you to, I'll repeat it a couple of times. This formula you need to remember, and not just remember, understand it from this diagram, which you have seen again in the in lecture 1 as well. Blood pressure is a product of cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. So blood pressure, i.e., let's go back to the basics. Blood pressure in arterial tree here is a product. It is depending on what it gets from the heart, that is cardiac output, and what is the resistance or the capacitance of this tree itself, which is the TPR. Okay, so if you increase the cardiac output and keep the peripheral resistance constant, what will happen? The blood pressure would rise. Okay, if you keep the cardiac output constant and you were to increase by constricting the arterioles, you were to increase the TPR, what would happen? The blood would start pooling in the arterial side, and that will increase the pressure. We say that the blood pressure has increased. Okay. If you really increase the profile of the heart, the contractility, the blood pressure really increases. But for that, you need to also release this resistance a bit. This is something that we'll touch upon later on. Coming back to the operative slide. So basically, cardiac output is the main determinant, one of the main determinants. Because this is when blood volume is introduced into the arterial system. So cardiac output is this, and arterial compliance is measured by total peripheral resistance. As I just explained, these are the two things which basically uh, determine your blood pressure. Okay. Um, some two minor points here is blood volume. If somehow you have gotten a transfusion, or Allah forbid, there is blood loss, so you have decreased volume in your circulation, blood pressure will fluctuate accordingly. So more blood volume, more blood pressure; less blood volume, less blood pressure. This is obvious. Distribution of blood, again, this is a point, minor point. The distribution of blood. Where is more of the blood located? You know, the whole blood volume is 5 liters, right? So out of this 5 liters, how much at any given time is in the arteries, and how much is in the veins? You know that veins, I beg your pardon, the veins have a reservoir function. They hold up blood as well, because they're also called capacitance vessels. So at any given time, what is the distribution of blood? This also affects blood pressure. This whole thing, have we done this slide? We have. So mean arterial pressure is directly proportional to cardiac output and resistance. This is the cardiac output, and this is the resistance against which this blood will flow out. This is the inlet, this is the outlet. If you constrict the outlet, the blood pressure will go up. If you increase the input, the blood pressure will go up, and decreases have corresponding opposite effects. This is a nice diagram to provide you the summary of what we discussed, mean arterial pressure. This is the heart. This is the TPR. This is the blood volume. This is that relative distribution. Okay. Take a moment to see some more details. And this, let me tell you, this is how the circulation system is, and this is why if you don't, if you if you were to cram this unit, it is it is highly undesirable, and it will actually in a conceptual viva or a conceptual MCQ, you just can't do it, because look, everything gets determined by something which in turn is getting determined by, say, two other things. Check this out first. Mean arterial pressure, we said that it depends on blood volume, right? Nobody told us that blood volume itself is getting determined by two, three things. This flow chart gives you that information too. So this is the kind of depth in information that you need to have to make the whole concept, which is the right thing to do, so that A, your knowledge is complete, B, the assessment does not cause you trouble. If you only were to rote memorize this primary relationship, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and if a question comes up which derives from this information and asks this information, you will have absolutely no clue, because that may not even mention the keyword, say, blood volume. So say you have a scenario of blood loss, and the examiner asks you, how come fluid loss or blood loss lead to any change in mean arterial pressure? So basically the classical answer is, since blood volume is a determinant of mean arterial pressure, any decreases in fluid volume would lead to decrease in blood pressure. That's the way. Heart is another example. Heart pumping, cardiac output, stroke volume, cardiac output rather, is determined in as we cardiac output has has a whole chapter later on in Guyton. So we'll be dissecting it later on in that. But just quickly, cardiac output is basically a product of heart rate into stroke volume. Heart rate multiplied by stroke volume is cardiac output. So if the questioner asks you, what if heart rate, so he doesn't mention anything from this whole thing, just mentions heart rate. What if in a person you have just enough sympathetic stimulation to cause a rise in heart rate? What will happen to his mean arterial blood pressure? So the answer is, heart rate will increase cardiac output, and cardiac output would then lead to increase in mean arterial pressure. So you see the multi-layer cake that circulation is. This is one variable, this is another variable, and then this is another variable. These variables develop this variable, and then this variable affects the main variable. This is how most of circulatory mechanisms are layered. I usually say they are a multi-layer cake. So if you like cake, you're good. You're good to go. Okay, so study this properly. Pause the video, go through it, try to understand what's going on, and make your concept, please. Don't rote memorize these things. Okay. Right. We go on to. So this is a summary of factors influencing mean arterial pressure. Now, some examples of what happens to mean arterial pressure in various situations. There are two situations here. Atherosclerosis, we've talked about it already, okay? And exercise, okay? Let me just put on this because I don't want you to see the whole thing, that distracts you. So let's just focus now on atherosclerosis. This is good. Now, PP is basically pulse pressure, okay? No, it's not the political party, God forbid. No, no. It's basically pulse pressure. So I'm saying atherosclerosis significantly changes pulse pressure, but it does not change mean arterial pressure. How? Go on, think. Think. Again, I miss interaction with my students. Atherosclerosis, as I just explained, is hardening of the arteries. So naturally, when in a hard artery, you were to introduce a bolus of blood, the systolic pressure will go through the roof. It will really increase. And since it won't contract, the diastolic pressure will really plummet. It will be decreased because there is no elastic recoil. Remember, elastic recoil is what generates diastolic pressure. So the difference between these two, a mathematical difference, will be enhanced. Yes, the systolic pressure is going up, the diastolic pressure is going down. If you subtract them, the result will be a bigger number, right? So we say that in atherosclerosis, you have pulse pressure, which increases significantly. This is aging also. In aging, this process increases, pulse pressure increases. However, mean arterial pressure due to atherosclerosis doesn't change much. If mean arterial pressure changes with age, which it does, it basically takes place due to other factors. Why doesn't mean arterial pressure change in atherosclerosis? Let's go back to its formula. Oh, oh. Right. This is the formula. We've just discussed it. Look at pulse pressure. Pulse pressure, remember, in atherosclerosis has increased. But look at the fraction. We are only taking 1/3 of this pulse pressure. So whatever increase of systolic pressure is in there due to atherosclerosis, it's hidden inside the pulse pressure subtraction. And then on top, we are taking only 1/3 of it. But what happens in the diastolic pressure? To the diastolic pressure. The diastolic pressure goes really, really down. And it's like a whole independent variable in this formula. So it really affects the overall mean arterial pressure. So when you add these two, the increase in systolic pressure is snubbed, is diluted. Hence, the overall result of this addition doesn't really change. So that's that. This is why atherosclerosis, you have these contrasting changes. Pulse pressure increases, mean arterial pressure doesn't change much. Not due to just this process only. It changes, but it changes for other reasons. Remember, these are Viva questions. What do you think would happen in exercise? In exercise, in exercise, the contraction of the heart increases, right? So the stroke volume would increase, the heart rate would increase, right? What is blood pressure? Blood pressure is equal to cardiac output multiplied by TPR, total peripheral resistance. Okay, so you are increasing cardiac output. But what happens to the TPR? That would have been such a candy question in a live lecture. For students who are not of this college, candy questions are questions which are difficult questions, and I actually physically give out candies. Imagine all the candies being wasted by this COVID, one of the problems with this COVID. Anyhow, so voila, look at this. In exercise, as we just were mentioning, the stroke volume goes up, the heart rate goes up, resultant in the cardiac output going up. However, this is from a book which mentions TPR as systemic vascular resistance. It's basically TPR. Okay. So TPR goes down. What's happening here? So if you have studied exercise, or maybe we'll discuss exercise in circulation, what happens? The skeletal muscles during exercise, which organ of the body are you using the most? It's skeletal muscles, right? So in skeletal muscles, the arterioles, due to a very special arrangement, they actually dilate. They actually dilate. So general effect of systemic circulation, sympathetic stimulation on circulation is contraction. You know that in arterioles, generally, sympathetic stimulation contracts those arterioles, right? However, in exercise, in muscles, in skeletal muscles, the arterioles actually dilate. This goes to, as you will study under changes in circulation during exercise, this goes down to the type of neurotransmitter that is released by sympathetic neurons on skeletal muscle arterioles. They are different actually. They cause dilation and not constriction. Physiology is just so cool, isn't it? So sympathetic stimulation would cause the heart to increase its profile, increasing its cardiac output, and dilate the exercising muscle arterioles to actually decrease the total peripheral resistance. Okay. So guess what? What is arterial blood pressure? Cardiac output multiplied by TPR. One is increasing, the other is decreasing. Result is little change. In fact, with mild to moderate exercise, it doesn't really change, okay? Because you want more blood to be pumped in a circulation, and you don't want much of resistance because you want this blood to go to the tissues. What would happen if you increase the TPR? That won't happen, right? So naturally, the system is tweaked to release more blood at the arteriolar end to the exercising muscles. And where does this blood come from? By increased heart performance. So there's little to no change in mean arterial pressure. Remember, in mild to moderate exercise, in severe exercise, in very high profile exercise, say some Olympic athlete, his or her mean arterial pressure would rise during strenuous exercise. Okay, this is the main crux of this scenario. Just a footnote here, look at the pulse pressure. During exercise, even mild exercise, the pulse pressure goes up. Why does it go up? Because stroke volume has increased, and we know that stroke volume basically determines, or cardiac output basically determines what? It determines systolic blood pressure. So it enhances systolic blood pressure, and since there's a decrease in vascular resistance, the diastolic recoil goes down a bit, resulting in increase in pulse pressure. I hope this is clear. These, by the way, these are two very important, very frequently asked questions. What happens to the various pressures in atherosclerosis? What happens to these two pressures in exercise? So remember this. Um, there are only a couple of slides left now in this lecture. These slides again are for good students. Every student is a good student, but some are more studious. They go for a deeper understanding of things than others. So this is basically for those kind of people. Well, everybody should really study it, but more so for the concept builders. So the following slides basically look at how mean arterial pressure and pulse pressure, how do they get affected by cardiac output? This is again just splitting ends in this relationship. We have gotten a taste of their interrelationship. So very simply, cardiac output enhances mean arterial pressure. It also enhances blood pressure, pulse pressure. This is that average Joe's response. But what about if you are Mr. Smarty Pants? What would happen then? So we know that mean arterial pressure is cardiac output multiplied by TPR, right? This we've done already this. And we have also touched upon cardiac output, this entity here, is a product of stroke volume into heart rate. So let me say it in a reverse order so you can really Remember this. Stroke volume and heart rate of the heart results in a cardiac output. This cardiac output then falls into the arteries. In arteries, it forms, together with the compliance of the vessels, it forms the mean arterial pressure. There you go. Now, we were talking about the effect of cardiac output on MAP and pulse pressure, right? So, cardiac output's effect on mean arterial pressure is independent. This basically means you increase cardiac output, of course, keeping TPR constant. You increase cardiac output, you increase mean arterial pressure. Don't be confused by the exercise example in which we were increasing cardiac output and decreasing TPR. We are now keeping this constant. We are only increasing cardiac output. So naturally, mean arterial pressure would go up. So this relationship is pretty independent. Another aspect of the word independent here is we don't really care which component of the cardiac output is increasing. Is it the stroke volume an increase in stroke volume which has caused an increase in cardiac output, or is it an increase in heart rate which has caused an increase in cardiac output, or is it an increase in both? Remember, we were splitting ends, right? I told you, I warned you. So in as regards to MAP, it doesn't really matter where the increase in cardiac output has come from. It doesn't matter. However, with pulse pressure, it does. Nobody said physiology is simple. The deeper you go, the more dividends you get. See, I used a positive word there. So pulse pressure, cardiac output's influence on pulse pressure depends. Now, this is where the condition is. Whether the cardiac output's increase came from the stroke volume or whether it came from the heart rate. What do I mean by that? We've done this. The following slide will only deal with this. So, scenario number 1. Heart rate increases, stroke volume decreases. You have a heart which is beating fast, but each beat is getting lesser volume out of the heart. Okay? This typically happens when only the heart rate increases and you don't have increased contractility with each beat. Okay. Now, again, you will do the math very quickly. Cardiac output would be constant because why? Because heart rate multiplied by stroke volume is cardiac output. And since one is increasing, the other is decreasing, the cardiac output would be constant. And since mean arterial pressure is dependent on cardiac output, keeping in mind that TPR is constant, mean arterial pressure would also be constant. Okay. However, pulse pressure decreases. Why has pulse pressure decreased? Pulse pressure has decreased because your systolic pressure, which depends on the stroke volume, has decreased. Once again, remember the heart is contracting more per minute, but each stroke volume, the volume that it's getting rid of, has actually decreased because you're not giving this heart enough time to fill. You have increased the heart rate, so you have decreased the diastolic time of filling of this heart. So what you have is, say, more stroke volumes per minute, but each stroke volume has really little to fetch from within the heart's end diastolic volumes. Okay, I've said it in like 2-3 ways now. So stroke volume would decrease, and we know that stroke volume is the main determinant of pulse pressure's systolic component. So in pulse pressure's systolic component goes down. The rest is chemistry. As soon as you do the subtraction, systolic minus diastolic, and you have decreased this, the whole thing will be decreased. So in this scenario, once again, in this scenario, the mean arterial pressure is constant while pulse pressure decreases for the previously mentioned decrease in stroke volume. Okay, the diastolic volume actually remains normal in this situation, sometimes increases as well. Scenario number two, it's the opposite. Heart rate decreases, but now each contraction, each contraction of this heart is enhanced. So you haven't really touched upon the chronotropy. You have increased the inotropy. See, I'm borrowing words from heart physiology. Chronotropy is the number of times heart contracts. The inotropy is the force of contraction of each contraction. So the typical example is of athletes. Okay, in athletes, basically they have bigger and stronger hearts. So you know that what athletes bradycardia is, right? This is that example here, right here. So the heart rate actually is lesser than 60, which in a normal person would have a problem. He would have bradycardia. But since this athlete's heart is bigger and stronger, he or she achieves a cardiac output at lesser heart rates because the stroke volume of each beat is strong and more than your average person, non-athletic person. Okay, so when you multiply this, you again get a constant cardiac output, very similar to this situation here, which then leads to a constant mean arterial pressure. Okay, I hope this is clear. Any guesses for pulse pressure? Well, the situation is right here. The answer is staring at you straight. Stroke volume has increased. It would increase the the pulse pressure. And since the pulse pressure would increase, you do the math. Systolic minus diastolic. This value has increased because of stroke volumes increase. The resultant pulse pressure would be higher than normal. Okay. So this is the end of this lecture. It was borrowed from some great names in physiology: Guyton, Boron, Rhodes, and Silverthorne. Good books to refer to in your free time. Uh, do discuss this amongst yourselves online, please. These are complicated matters. Remember the scenarios that I discussed, 4 scenarios: atherosclerosis, exercise, and then the 2 pulse pressure examples. These are very cool concepts if you understand them, and if you're fortunate enough to have an examiner which delves into these things, so that your understanding really comes out where it needs to, and you are rewarded for it as well, inshallah. Okay, so be vigilant in your tutorials. We have decreased the time, but that does not mean that we will compromise on quality. Read up on this stuff. I'll be making myself some scenarios and a theme as well, which will run throughout the circulation lectures, inshallah. The theme is on essential hypertension. You will be looking at Mr. Arsalan going through various phases of his life. So that is a theme that will run across the circulation lectures, inshallah. While specifically on blood pressure, this particular lecture, there will be a scenario or two which your tutorial teachers will discuss with you, inshallah. Okay, let's stop sharing.